The sky above Seoul turned black in a single moment. Min Seo looked up from her laboratory desk and saw the massive shadow pass over the city like a storm cloud, but this cloud was metal and fire. The Velarinth mothership descended slowly, almost casually, as if the aliens did not care whether humans noticed them or ran away in fear. They did not care because they had conquered 300 worlds before Earth, and they expected to conquer 300 more after. The invasion began at dawn. Plasma beams carved through buildings like a knife through paper. The military tried to fight back, but human weapons were useless against shields that had stopped starship weapons from distant planets. Within hours, governments fell. Within days, major cities surrendered or burned. The Velarinth did not need to conquer all of Earth at once. They only needed to break the will of humanity to resist. And they were very good at breaking things. Commander Teo stood on the observation deck of the mothership and watched the world below with satisfaction. His compound eyes, the color of deep ocean water, reflected the fires of Seoul as it burned. He was tall and thin, his skin a shade of silver that seemed to glow under the ship's lights. Like all Velarinth, he felt connected to every other member of his species through the collective consciousness, a hive mind that made his people impossible to defeat. Individual humans could be brave or smart, but they were alone in their heads. The Velarinth were never alone. They were always many, thinking as one. "They will surrender within 3 weeks," Teo told his second officer, a female Velarinth named Krell. "The data on primitive species suggests that once their governments fall, the people lose hope. Hope is what sustains resistance. Remove hope, and you remove the will to fight." But Commander Teo did not understand humans. No one in the Velarinth collective truly understood them, because understanding would have required seeing humans as something more than primitive animals. It would have required seeing humans as equals, and that was something the Velarinth could never do. In the ruins of what had once been Seoul's tech district, Min Seo led her sister Hai Wan and her brother Ji Ho down into a bunker that had been hidden beneath her university laboratory. The three siblings had worked together for years on quantum computing, biology, and weapons design. The work had been peaceful then. Now it was war. The laboratory had been destroyed above them, but below, in the deep places where the Velarinth had not yet looked, they could still think and plan. Min Seo was the oldest at 34 years old. She had dark hair that was now covered in dust from the explosions above. Her eyes were sharp and careful, always thinking several steps ahead like a chess player. She was thin from stress and had not slept properly since the invasion began. Her hands shook as she worked, but her mind was clear and focused. Haewon was 31, and she was different from her sister. Where Min Seo built things with equations and careful thought, Haewon built things with courage and strength of will. She had been a soldier in Korea's army for 8 years before the invasion. She moved like someone who had trained her body for combat, and her eyes held the look of someone who had already decided that she would rather die fighting than live as a slave. Jiho was the youngest at 26. He was quieter than his sisters, with a gentle face that seemed too kind for the violent world that was forming around them. But appearances were deceiving. Jiho had quick reflexes and a mind that could see 3 steps ahead in a fight. He had watched the Velarinth weapons during the invasion, and he was already thinking about how to break them. "We need to find others," Haewon said as she looked over maps of the city on a broken computer screen. "We cannot fight this war with just 3 people." "Agreed," Min Seo replied. She was studying a piece of alien technology that one of the soldiers had managed to steal before dying. It was small, about the size of her hand, and it hummed with power she did not yet understand. "But we need something to offer them. We need a plan that shows we can actually hurt these things." For the next 3 weeks, while the Velarinth celebrated their easy victory, human resistance cells began to form across the entire planet. Most were small groups of soldiers and civilians who simply refused to accept alien rule. They sabotaged supply lines, freed prisoners, and tried to gather weapons. Most of them had no real plan. They were just fighting because surrender meant slavery or death. But the groups that Min Seo and Hai Wan gathered were different. They had a purpose. Min Seo reverse-engineered the stolen alien technology piece by piece. She discovered that the Velarinth computers used a neural network system. They literally plugged their minds into their machines. This was their greatest strength, allowing all their soldiers to think as one. But Min Seo began to understand it was also a weakness. She designed a biological weapon, a virus that could disrupt the neural connection between individual Velarinth soldiers and the collective consciousness. It would not kill them, but it would isolate their minds. For a species that had never been alone in their thoughts, this isolation would be devastating. Hai Wan, meanwhile, worked with her growing resistance army to study Velarinth patrol patterns and military positions. She trained recruits in fighting techniques that would work against aliens who had never fought a war where they did not already know what the enemy would do. She taught humans to be unpredictable, to change tactics constantly, to use their numbers and their knowledge of Earth against superior alien technology. 3 months into the occupation, the Velarinth began to notice something strange. Their supply convoys were being attacked. Their soldiers were going missing. Their communication towers were being destroyed. The humans were not surrendering. The humans were fighting back, and they were getting smarter about it with every passing day. Commander Teo received reports of increasing resistance activity, but he did not understand the danger. In his experience with 300 conquered worlds, resistance always faded after the first months. Humans were too disorganized, too divided, too weak. He sent reports to the Velarinth Council that everything was under control, that within a year, Earth would be fully integrated into the collective as a resource world. But in the bunkers and hidden places below cities and mountains across the world, Min Seo worked through equations, and Hai Wan trained her soldiers. Jiho practiced with weapons that the humans had stolen or created, and slowly, the impossible became possible. Slowly, humanity began to believe that they might not die as slaves after all. The invasion that was supposed to take 3 weeks to complete had, by the 3rd month, become something neither the Velarinth nor humanity had expected. It had become a real war. By the 3rd year of the war, everything had changed. The Velarinth were no longer the unstoppable force they had believed themselves to be. They were scared, though they would never admit this fear to each other. Fear was something that only affected prey animals, not conquerors. But the fear was there, moving through the collective consciousness like poison through clean water, and even the strongest Velarinth soldiers could feel it spreading. Min Seo stood in her laboratory, a much larger facility now, hidden deep beneath the Korean peninsula in a network of caves that had been expanded and filled with stolen alien technology. Her fingers flew across holographic screens, analyzing data from the latest tests. Behind her, dozens of scientists from around the world worked in quiet focus. They were Chinese, American, Indian, Brazilian, Japanese, European, and African. They were men and women, young and old. They had all lost everything to the Velarinth, and they had all found a new purpose. The biological weapon was finally ready. Min Seo had called it the neural disruptor, though the scientists more often just called it the virus. It was elegant in its simplicity. The Velarinth depended on their connection to the collective consciousness to think and function as a unified force. The virus would not kill them. Instead, it would isolate them, cutting their minds off from the hive mind they had depended on since birth. For creatures who had never been alone with their own thoughts, the isolation would be like going blind and deaf at the same time. "The delivery system is ready," a young Korean scientist named Dong-woo told her. He was brilliant with chemistry, and had figured out how to package the virus in a form that could survive in Earth's atmosphere and then activate when it came into contact with Velarinth biology. We have tested it 17 times. It works every single time. Minseo nodded. She felt the weight of what they were about to do. This weapon would change the course of the war. It would also change humanity itself. Using a biological weapon went against everything her people had said they stood for. But those values meant nothing if humans were wiped out. Sometimes the hardest choices were the most necessary ones. High above, in a command center that had once been an old military base in the mountains, HFY studied maps and reports with Jiho and her senior officers. She had been promoted to the rank of Supreme Commander by the surviving governments of Earth, though there were very few functioning governments anymore. Most of them were simply groups of military leaders and resistance fighters who had decided together that they would fight or die. HFY was different now than she had been 3 years ago. The young soldier who had believed in rules and orders was gone. In her place was a commander who understood that war had no rules except winning and losing. Her face was harder, her eyes colder. She had lost friends, lovers, and soldiers by the thousands. She had learned to make decisions that cost lives, and she had learned to live with those choices. The Pacific Fleet Base is defended by approximately 5,000 Velarinth soldiers, said Captain No, a Chinese woman who had worked her way up from a simple soldier to one of HFY's most trusted commanders. But our intelligence suggests they do not expect a coordinated assault from multiple locations. They believe we are too scattered, too disorganized. They are wrong, HFY said simply. When Minseo's weapon is ready, we strike everywhere at once. Pacific, Atlantic, Indian Ocean. We hit every Velarinth base and ship we can find within a 12-hour period. The virus will spread through their soldiers. They will be confused, isolated, terrified. That is when we push them off our world. Jiho watched his sister plan the war with a strange feeling. He loved HFY, but sometimes when he looked at her, he saw a stranger. The war had changed her in ways that could not be undone. It had made her efficient, deadly, and completely without mercy. He wondered if any of them would be the same people they had been before the invasion. "How much longer until the weapon is ready?" HFY asked. 2 weeks, a communication officer told her. Dr. Minseo estimates 2 weeks for final testing and production. Then we can move. HFY stood and walked to the window. Through the glass, she could see the Velarinth occupation forces moving through the valleys below. They had taken over military bases, government buildings, and the tallest towers in every city. They flew their ships over human lands as if they owned everything. Soon, very soon, that would end. 2 weeks later, Commander Teo was receiving reports of strange behavior among his soldiers. Some were complaining of voices in their heads that were not the collective consciousness. Others were reporting feeling isolated, cut off from the familiar connection to all other Velarinth minds. A few soldiers had completely stopped responding to orders, simply standing motionless in their positions as if their brains had shut down. At first, Teo believed it was a new form of human attack. But then his own consciousness began to change. The familiar presence of millions of other Velarinth minds that had always been there, as natural as breathing, began to fade. For the first time in his life, Teo was alone inside his own head. The panic was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His mind, which had been shaped by millennia of hive consciousness, was not designed to be alone. Without the other minds to lean on, to share thoughts with, he felt himself beginning to break apart. And that was when the human attacks came. HFY led the assault on the Pacific Fleet Base herself, flying in a stolen Velarinth ship alongside dozens of other human pilots in captured alien aircraft. The Velarinth defenders were chaos and confusion. Without the collective consciousness directing them, they could not think as one unified force. Some tried to fight. Others simply froze, overwhelmed by the sudden isolation in their own minds. The battle lasted only 3 hours. The human forces took the base with heavy casualties, but they took it. The Velarinth forces fled or surrendered, their commanders broken by the loss of the hive mind they had always depended on. Across the world, the same story repeated. 12 coordinated attacks struck Velarinth positions simultaneously. 12 times, the aliens found themselves facing an enemy they could not understand, a species that fought with unity and purpose even though they were still individuals. 12 times, humans fought with everything they had and refused to stop. By the end of the first day of the coordinated assault, the Velarinth had lost more soldiers than they had lost in any single battle in the previous 3 years. By the end of the first week, the occupation forces were completely disorganized. The collective consciousness was shattered, replaced by screaming voices of fear and confusion in the minds of every Velarinth soldier on Earth. Commander Teo sat alone in his quarters on the mothership, his hands shaking. His empire was falling apart. The species that he had believed were primitive animals had defeated him. For the first time, he understood that the Velarinth might actually lose this war. And he realized something else, something that would change everything that came after. He was afraid of humans. 3 days later, Commander Teo did something unprecedented. He requested a meeting with HFY, and when the human commander arrived at the negotiation point, he surrendered himself completely. He offered to give humanity all the classified secrets of the Velarinth collective. He told them how their empire was organized, where their weaknesses were, how their ships could be destroyed. He became humanity's greatest intelligence asset, and with his help, the war began to turn decisively in humanity's favor. The Velarinth had come to conquer Earth expecting an easy victory. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that would not break, would not surrender, and would not accept slavery. They found themselves facing humans, and they discovered that humans were far more dangerous than anything in the galaxy had ever prepared them to face. The Velarinth mothership hung in orbit above Earth like a sword suspended over a prisoner's head. It was massive, larger than any human structure ever built. Cities could have fit inside it. With a single command, it could reduce all of Earth to ash. The human leaders knew this. The Velarinth commanders knew this. Everyone understood that as long as the mothership remained intact, humanity's victory was not complete. HFY stood in the command center and studied the ship's specifications that Commander Teo had provided. The information was detailed and precise. Teo had explained every weakness, every vulnerable point, every place where the ship's defenses were thinnest. The problem was that even with all this information, attacking the mothership seemed like a suicide mission. A human strike team would need to approach an orbiting vessel in space, break through multiple defensive shields, fight past thousands of Velarinth soldiers, reach the core reactor, plant explosives, and then somehow escape. The odds of success were virtually zero. "It can be done," Jiho said quietly. He had been studying the same information for hours, and his younger mind had found patterns and possibilities that others had missed. But it requires pilots who know they will probably not come back. Minseo looked at her brother, and she understood immediately what he was thinking. "No," she said firmly. "You are not volunteering for this." "I have to," Jiho replied. He spoke in the calm voice of someone who had already accepted his own death. "I am the best pilot we have. I trained on Velarinth ships before the invasion even ended. No one else can do this." "Then we send someone else," Minseo said. "Someone who is not my brother." But HFY was already nodding. She had learned in 3 years of war that sometimes the people you loved had to be the ones who died. "Jiho is right," she said. "We cannot afford to lose. And we cannot afford to waste our best pilot just to protect my feelings or yours. We have an army of humans who depend on us to give them a future worth living in. If that costs Jiho's life, then we pay that price." Jiho stood and embraced both his sisters. He said nothing, because there were no words left that mattered. Minseo held him and felt her heart breaking, but she did not try to stop him. In war, love sometimes meant letting the people you loved die for something larger than themselves. The next 2 weeks were spent preparing the assault. Volunteers came forward from every military on Earth. They wanted to fly in the attack on the mothership. Over 1,000 pilots and soldiers volunteered, knowing they were volunteering for almost certain death. HFY selected 200 of the very best. These would be the ones to fly the captured Velarinth ships toward the mothership. Some would draw fire from the defenses. Others would attempt the actual infiltration. Only a handful would have any chance of returning. Jiho trained the pilots in everything he had learned about Velarinth ship controls. He flew multiple practice runs in the captured vessels. He studied the mothership's defense patterns. He worked with engineers to plan the exact approach angle that would give them the best possible chance of avoiding the heaviest concentrations of fire. The night before the assault, Minseo brought her brother food that she had cooked herself. The ingredients were difficult to find. Most of Earth was suffering from hunger as the war continued, but she had found what she needed. They sat together in silence, eating and remembering happier times when their biggest concern was finishing a research paper or winning a soccer game. "I am afraid," Jiho admitted. "I know," Minseo said. "It is good to be afraid. Fear keeps you careful. Fear keeps you alive. What if I fail? Then we will have lost our best pilot, and the war will become much harder. But humans will keep fighting anyway because that is what we do. We fail, and we keep fighting." Jiho looked at his sister's face, and he tried to memorize it. He wanted to remember exactly how her eyes looked, how she held herself, the way she had of making everything seem like it would be okay, even when it clearly would not be. The assault began just before dawn. 200 human pilots in stolen Velarinth ships rose from the atmosphere in a coordinated formation. The mothership's defenses came alive immediately. Energy weapons that could destroy entire cities opened fire at the approaching swarm of ships. The first wave of human ships took the heaviest fire. These were the sacrificial pilots, the ones who had volunteered knowing their only purpose was to draw the enemy's attention away from the ships carrying the strike team. Within minutes, 50 human ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Their pilots died screaming, but they died knowing they were saving humanity. Jiho led the second wave, the infiltration group. His ship twisted and turned through the incoming fire, dancing between energy beams like a fish swimming through a deadly river. Other pilots flew alongside him, and one by one they fell away as their ships were hit. The Velarinth defenses were incredibly advanced, designed to stop other alien warships, not primitive human fighters. That the humans survived at all seemed like a miracle. By the time the infiltration team reached the mothership's docking bay, only 12 ships remained. 11 of them carried soldiers and equipment. Jiho's ship was the 12th, and it was already damaged from the defensive fire. But the pilots managed to breach the docking bay and land inside the massive vessel. What happened next happened fast. Velarinth soldiers tried to stop the human boarding team, but without the collective consciousness holding them together, they were confused and slow. The humans moved through the mothership like ghosts, leaving death and fire in their wake. Minseo's virus had made the Velarinth soldiers vulnerable in ways they had never been vulnerable before. Against disciplined human soldiers, they broke apart and fell back. Jiho and his team fought through 3 levels of the ship toward the core reactor. Soldiers fell around him. His best friend, a woman named Su Young, was struck by an energy weapon and collapsed. Jiho could not help her. There was no time for helping anyone. There was only the mission and the need to reach the reactor before more soldiers arrived. When they reached the reactor chamber, Jiho himself planted the explosives. The device he carried was simple but powerful. It would destroy the entire reactor and, by extension, Disable the mothership completely. The timer would give them approximately 10 minutes to escape before the explosion consumed everything. Go, Jiho told the remaining soldiers. Get to the ships. Get back to Earth. What about you? One of the soldiers asked. I will follow, Jiho said, knowing it was a lie. He knew the escape route was already cut off, that Velarinth reinforcements had sealed the passage behind them. He knew that he would not be able to make it back to the ships in time, but the soldier did not need to know these things. The soldier needed to believe there was hope. As the remaining soldiers ran back toward the docking bay, Jiho activated the explosives. The timer began its countdown. He could hear Velarinth soldiers getting closer, hear their weapons charging, hear the sounds of the ship around him beginning to fail. He thought of his sisters. He thought of Min Seo's smile and Haiwan's strength. He thought of Earth and all the people depending on this moment. He thought of how strange it was that he would die here, inside an alien ship orbiting above his home, so that those at home could live free. The explosion came suddenly, without warning. It consumed the reactor chamber and the surrounding sections of the ship. It was the last thing Jiho ever experienced, and in his final moment, he knew that he had succeeded. The mothership was destroyed. Humanity would live. Above Earth, the massive Velarinth vessel lurched and began to fall from the sky. The remaining human ships jumped away from the docking bay just before the explosion tore through it. 11 soldiers made it back. 1 human pilot, a man named Jiho, who had volunteered to save his world, did not. When the news reached Earth, humanity wept and celebrated at the same time. They had lost one of their best, but they had gained something priceless, the knowledge that they could win. The mothership fell to Earth, crashing harmlessly into the ocean. The Velarinth command structure fell with it. The war was almost over, and the real reckoning was about to begin. 2 months after the mothership fell from the sky, the Velarinth Council arrived at Earth. Their fleet was smaller than the invasion force had been, but it was still massive and intimidating. These were not soldiers and occupation troops. These were the rulers of the Velarinth Empire, ancient beings who had lived for hundreds of years and had never experienced defeat. They came to understand how their greatest military asset had been destroyed by a species they had considered barely conscious. The Velarinth Council consisted of 7 ancient beings. They had ruled the Empire for so long that no one could remember the time before them. Their leader was a being named Korash, and he had personally overseen the conquest of more worlds than most species had civilizations. His skin was the color of old silver, and his eyes held the weight of centuries of absolute power. He had always believed that the universe was made for the Velarinth to rule, and all other species existed only to serve them or to be destroyed. Korash stood in the observation room of his ship and looked down at Earth. The planet was beautiful, he thought. The greens and blues and whites of forests and oceans and clouds were pretty in the way that anything alive could be pretty. But pretty did not matter. The only thing that mattered was that humans had somehow defeated the Velarinth occupation force. This was impossible, and yet it had happened. How? Korash demanded of his advisors. How did these creatures defeat us? No one had a good answer. The military reports showed everything. The invasion had been simple at first. Humans had tried to fight with primitive weapons and had failed. But then something had changed. The humans had learned. They had adapted. They had discovered that the Velarinth depended on the collective consciousness, and they had found a way to attack it. They used biological weapons, one advisor explained. The humans released a virus that disrupted our neural connections. We have faced biological weapons before, Korash said coldly. We have thousands of vaccines against biological attack. This one was different, the advisor said nervously. It was designed specifically against our neurology. Only a species with deep knowledge of our biology could have created it. How could they have such knowledge? The answer came slowly, but it came. Commander Teo, the leader of the occupation force, had surrendered to the humans and given them everything. He had given them classified information about the Velarinth. He had betrayed his own species. For a moment, Korash was silent. Then he began to laugh, a long and terrible sound that echoed through the ship. "He surrendered?" the ancient being asked. "The leader of our forces surrendered to creatures that had been primitive animals only months before?" The advisors said nothing. Korash's anger was building like a storm, and they had learned long ago that it was safer to simply wait for the storm to pass. "We will call a meeting with the human leaders," Korash finally said. "We will discover how this happened, and we will teach these creatures what happens when they challenge the Velarinth." The meeting took place on a neutral space station that had been hastily constructed in orbit between the Velarinth fleet and Earth. Haywan traveled there with a small group of representatives from the surviving human governments. She wore the uniform of Supreme Commander, and she had learned to walk and speak with the confidence of someone who had never lost a war that mattered. Korash and the council looked at her with something between curiosity and disgust. Could this creature, this small female human with short dark hair and eyes that would blink out and die in less than a century, actually be the one who had defeated them? It seemed impossible, but the evidence was clear. "You have done an impressive thing," Korash said, and his voice carried the weight of someone used to absolute obedience. "You have temporarily defeated a single occupation force. This changes nothing about your ultimate fate. The Velarinth Collective spans thousands of worlds. We have trillions of soldiers. What happened here was merely a setback." "It was more than a setback," Haywan replied quietly. "It was a defeat. You sent your best forces to conquer us. We destroyed them. You sent your command ship. We destroyed that too. You can call it what you like, but the result is the same. The Velarinth are not invincible." The council members looked at each other, and Haywan could see the anger moving between them. No one had ever spoken to them like this. No one had ever challenged their absolute authority so calmly and directly. "We are offering you a chance to negotiate," Haywan continued. "Humanity is offering Earth as a neutral zone. You can take your ships and leave. In exchange, we demand that the Velarinth withdraw from all occupied worlds. We demand that you submit to a war crimes tribunal for the atrocities committed on hundreds of planets. We demand that you recognize humanity as a free species and never attempt to enslave us again." "You demand?" Korash's voice rose to a level that made the human translator devices struggle to process the sound. "You are in no position to demand anything. We could bombard this entire planet from orbit right now. We could reduce it to ash and dust. We could exterminate every human alive in a matter of hours. What makes you think you can demand anything from us?" Haywan stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Velarinth fleet hung in space, massive and terrible and beautiful in its absolute power. Any human facing that fleet should have been terrified. And perhaps Haywan was terrified. But she had learned to hide fear so completely that not even she could feel it anymore. "You are right that you could destroy Earth," she said without turning around. "But you will not." "Why not?" Korash demanded. "Because you are no longer sure that you can," Haywan replied. She turned to face the council, and her eyes held something that made even the ancient Velarinth hesitate. "You came here absolutely certain of your power. You expected to conquer us easily. Instead, we beat you. That has made you afraid. And afraid conquerors do not attack. Afraid conquerors look for justifications not to attack. So you will not bombard Earth, because you are afraid of what we might do to you if you try." The council erupted in angry voices, but Korash silenced them with a gesture. He looked at the small human woman before him. And for the first time in his long life, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake in coming to Earth at all. "You will regret this insolence," Korash said flatly. The Velarinth always destroy those who challenge us. Then prepare to break a very old tradition, HFY replied. She turned to leave, and her human delegation stood and followed her toward the door. We will give you 1 week to make your decision. Either you begin withdrawing from all occupied worlds, or we will come at you with everything we have. And this time, we will finish the job. As the humans left, Korash sat in silence. His advisors waited nervously for his response. The ancient being looked out at his massive fleet and realized something he had never faced before: doubt. And doubt, for someone who had lived his entire life certain of absolute victory, was more frightening than any human weapon could ever be. The Velarinth Council debated for 3 days. Some members wanted to accept HFY's demands. They had seen what humans could do with captured alien technology and biological weapons. They feared that another direct conflict might actually result in the Velarinth being defeated, which was something their collective mind could barely comprehend. But Korash would not hear of surrender. He was ancient and powerful and accustomed to absolute obedience. The idea that he should run from a primitive species was not something he could accept. We will make an example of them, Korash declared to his council. We will bombard the planet with orbital weapons. We will reduce every human city to rubble. We will kill every human alive. Other species in the galaxy will see what happens when you challenge the Velarinth. They will see total extinction. The other council members disagreed, but Korash held the final authority. His will was law among the Velarinth. The order was given. The massive fleet began to move into position for a planet-wide bombardment. The weapons systems came online, charging with power that had never been fully tested. Korash felt confident again. Whatever tricks the humans possessed, they could not stand against the full might of the Velarinth collective. In her command center beneath the Korean peninsula, Minseo received the warning signals from the human satellites that still monitored the Velarinth fleet. The bombardment would begin in less than 6 hours. She called HFY immediately. They are going to do it, Minseo said, her voice steady but carrying a tone of controlled fear. They are going to attack. I expected this, HFY replied. Did you complete the second phase? Yes. The infiltration teams are in position. They have been hiding inside the Velarinth fleet since the truce talks. They are ready to move. 3 weeks earlier, while everyone was watching the Council's movements, HFY had sent volunteers into the Velarinth fleet. These brave humans, wearing stolen suits and using forged identification codes that Commander Teo had provided, had hidden themselves in various ships and stations. They had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. Tell them to execute the plan, HFY ordered. Minseo sent the signal, and the infiltration teams moved. They had a very simple mission: disable the ship's defense shields and power systems from the inside. They had been provided with codes and instructions and weapons. Most would not survive, but if even some of them succeeded, the plan would work. The sabotage began subtly. A power coupling here, a control panel there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately alert the Velarinth. But within an hour, the various ships in the fleet began to experience system failures. Shields flickered. Weapons powered down. One by one, the great vessels that had seemed unstoppable were reduced to damaged hulks drifting in space. Korash realized too late what was happening. The humans had hidden themselves inside his own fleet. They had used his trust in their supposed lack of technology against him. The ancient being felt something he had never felt before: true panic. "What is happening?" he demanded of his officers. "Fix these systems. Restore power to the weapons." But even as his officers tried desperately to restore the systems, another signal came through. This one was transmitted from deep within the largest Velarinth warship, the vessel that housed half of Korash's fleet command structure. The signal was a message. A voice came through, speaking in halting Velarinth language but with perfect clarity and absolute confidence. "This is Pilot Jiho," the voice said. "I survived the destruction of your mothership. I have been hiding in your fleet, and I am here to deliver a message from the human race." There was a moment of silence. Then the massive Velarinth warship shuddered with an internal explosion. The explosion was small compared to what it could have been, but it was enough. It was enough to disable the main power reactor. It was enough to blind the ship. It was enough to change everything. Korash stared at the communications display, unable to understand what he was seeing. The human pilot was alive. The human pilot had been hiding inside his own fleet the entire time. The human pilot had just crippled one of his most important vessels. How was this possible? How could a primitive species be so clever? Then his own communications officer looked up with horror in her eyes. "Supreme Leader, the other ships are reporting similar explosions. The infiltration team, they have disabled shield generators across the entire fleet. We are completely vulnerable." And that was when the human attack came. But this attack was different from the desperate resistance they had fought before. This attack was coordinated and professional, and absolutely devastating. Haywan had learned from the Velarinth how to wage war against a powerful enemy, and she had become very good at it. The human attack ships descended on the crippled Velarinth fleet. There was almost no resistance. Without their shields, the alien vessels were easy prey. The humans had learned to read Velarinth weapons patterns. They had learned to predict Velarinth defensive maneuvers. They had learned to think like their enemy and then think faster than them. Ship after ship fell. Some exploded in brilliant flashes of energy. Others simply stopped responding, their systems dead, their crews wandering through dark corridors in confusion and fear. The collective consciousness that had always held them together was still broken. Individual Velarinth soldiers, scared and alone in their own minds, were easy to defeat. Korash watched it all happen from his command ship, unable to stop it, unable to prevent the destruction of everything he had built. For the first time in his long life, the ancient being understood what it was like to be helpless, and that helplessness broke something inside him. "Cease all hostile actions," he finally ordered, his voice no longer carrying the weight of absolute authority. Now it was just the tired voice of an old being facing defeat. "Stand down. We surrender." On the space station where the truce talks had taken place, Haywan received the surrender. The Velarinth Council, or what remained of it, agreed to all of humanity's demands. They would withdraw from all occupied worlds. They would submit to a war crimes tribunal. They would recognize humanity as a free and independent species. But more than that, they would spread the word throughout the galaxy. The Velarinth would tell every other species they encountered that they had met a race that would not be conquered. A race that would fight without mercy when mercy was no longer an option. A race that had started with nothing but hunger and desperation and had somehow become unbeatable. Minseo watched from Earth as the Velarinth fleet turned away from the planet and began to move toward the dark space beyond the solar system. She was exhausted. She had not slept in 2 days, but she had also never felt more alive. Jiho appeared on the video screen. His face was burned and scarred, and he moved carefully, as if he was in pain. But his eyes were alive with something like joy. "You survived," Minseo said, tears starting to run down her face. "I did," Jiho replied. "I hid in the ventilation systems when the first explosion happened. It was a good hiding place. I have been living there for 3 months, waiting for the right moment." Haywan embraced both her siblings through the communication screens, her face displaying emotion for the first time in what felt like years. Humanity had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that should have been unstoppable, humans had refused to accept defeat. And in refusing to accept defeat, they had learned a truth that would change the course of galactic history. Mercy is a word that only creatures with power can afford. The Velarinth, for all their strength, had never understood this. But humanity did. Humanity understood it perfectly.